So I just listened to AKA's new album called Mass Country, and I'm gonna give it a solid 2 out of 10. I absolutely hate everything about this album. It's absolutely one of the worst albums I've ever heard in my life. Sonically, it doesn't even sound good. The mixing is terrible. I do not like this album one bit. It has.
We live in the era where everybody has their opinion amplified by virtue of social media. And what that has done is that it's caught a fire that's created a general atmosphere where people feel freer to speak their minds, to have their opinions out in the public on virtually anything that they care about yapping about. But half of the time, these opinions aren't really rooted in anything knowledgeable. They aren't contextualized by insight. They are whimsical opinions that are, for the most part, sheerly based on surface level impressions. And I'm not saying people don't have the right to have their surface level impressions. I'm just saying that what the era of social media has done to the climate of criticism is that it's conflated, it's confused real critique for shallow hot takes. It's blurred the lines between insightful, analytical, critical theory and opportunistic hot takes. What we do here on the Headspace, what I would like to think, is very much the former. My name is VJ, the brother from the ancient mother, and I consider myself a critical theorist, a musical journalist, and above all else, somebody with a passion for analyzing the virtue, the value, and the ultimate consequence of the art that we consume. And if you're watching this for the first time, this is the Headspace. We call it Africa's most poignant channel because what we want to do is distill the noise that's going on into compact episodes where I attempt to crystallize the balance between market demand, artistic freedom, and where those two things meet. In other words, what we've always aspired to do on this channel is to do more than give an opinion. Because anybody can have an opinion if they have the capacity to witness something, but it takes real insight and real understanding to give a critique. I'm here to break down what the difference is between an opinion and a critique. And I'm here to explain why, as the Headspace, we no longer categorize the review section as reviews, but we now call them analyses. This has all come from reflection on the climate of where we are, with different reviewers popping up all over the world, including the country that we inhabit, South Africa. And that's amazing for the culture of YouTube in Africa, to have people who are bold enough to have their opinions out there and to challenge the artists who we love and to reflect on the artists we hate and to just have the whole affair of art and the consummation of art be seen in light of how we feel about these things, and I feel most importantly, what motivates these feelings. So let me take you on a bit of a journey on criticism and its essential role in the world. Now, if you're talking about the critic emerges in the midst of social discourse. In simple terms, a critic is somebody who has taken the time to study the mechanisms of whatever aspect of society in order to make sure it runs properly. A political critic is somebody who tries to understand the bases of the political elements that govern our world in order to give an opinion that allows us to understand what's really going on in politics. We don't all have the time to focus on everything happening in the world. So there are people, experts, whose insight we trust because they dedicate their lives to trying to zone in on a particular part of life in society in order for the rest of us to understand what are the motions, the ebbs and flows, and the fundamental rules that constitute that particular world. And how does it trickle back to me and you and to all of us ultimately? So when it comes to music journalism, for as long as there has been a music industry, there have been music critics. The music critics emerge as people who are there to help the audience understand what to expect and to also help the audience understand where the artist is at that particular moment. So it's a two-way relationship. A critic is there to understand the artist, but to understand the audience that the artist is speaking to. Because everybody is speaking to a particular focus group. There is no art that is all-encompassing. It can be broad, but every art kind of narrows itself down to particular people. It might be varied, but there's a quality about art that focuses it into certain issues, certain times, certain eras, certain styles and forms and textures. And as a result, those who understand how the methodology of a certain art works can hone into an audience, understand the relationship that's being built between, say, the jazz artist and the jazz listener, the rap artist and the rap listener, and so forth and so on, njalo njalo. So for what we do here in the Headspace, it was so important for me to understand the length and breadth of the history of South Africa's music industry. And this is my first fundamental point. The difference between opinion and critique is that an opinion is very much inspired by what a person knows in the moment. A critique is inspired by a historical analysis. A critic judges an artist not only by virtue of what they're doing, but how what they're doing fits into the tradition that they're part of. Because it informs how that artist is performing in the context of their genre, their movement, their school, however you want to term it. If I am doing an album review on a rap artist, it is going to be focused on the artist as an individual and their journey, but on a greater scale, it is about the movement that they are part of. If it is a rap artist, then I have to talk about how they fit into the picture of rap historically and what they contribute. Because it would be an counterproductive exercise to try and talk about an artist outside of the rules, stereotypes, fashions, trends, and all-round characteristics that govern the world that that artist is a part of. And so I think one of the most glaring things about the difference between opinion and critique is that an opinion does not care to know or does not have the ability to know what it's really basing its critique on. An opinion would say so and so's music sucks ass, but it will never give you a expanded sense of the because. Because when you say something is in good or bad taste, you kind of imply to elaborate on what that opinion is even rooted in. So I think the critic, more than anything, is focused on giving the why than really giving you the answer. A critic is there to spark the question. A critic is there to give you insight into the subtle rules that, as listeners of music, we don't always think about when we're listening to music. Because for the most part, let's go now. Umculo is an experience that we filter out through our emotional experience. I said experience twice, but that's cool. Because in essence, what that does as listeners is we are in a process that really doesn't allow us to think too much. As a matter of fact, music that makes you think is oftentimes the worst kind of music, because even if it's leaning on an intellectual slant, really great music touches you in a place that's beyond words and thought. And so, as a critic, what you're attempting to do is return back to the place of words to explain something that feels transcendent to words. And that's why it's so fucking hard. It takes a lot of time to try and find the right words to explain the sounds you're hearing, to explain the musical trends you're hearing, to explain how they sit into a song, to understand the structure of a song, to understand different aspirations for songwriting, and to try and identify what an artist in question is trying to do if you're going to say they're not doing it or they are doing it. So fundamentally, the first principle where you can tell the difference between an opinion and a critique is that opinions are wild thoughts and ramblings that we all have the right to give, that are simply based on our own personal experiences. But critiques are structured ideas based on an insight into the ideology and the subsequent history of whatever you're trying to critique. Second, it is important to understand the socio-economic environment that affects the artist's work. Capitalism puts artists into a predicament where they have to consider the commercial value of their ideas. They have to go into a place where their inspiration translates into possible currency. And that's a difficult situation to be in, because it means you have to question your every idea in terms of whether or not it will be able to make bank. And this is what a lot of record labels and just generally the business side of music tends to take the raw sheer inspiration of artists and put them through the systematic evaluation of product. So once a piece of art becomes a product, once an inspiration turns into something to sell to people, then what you have is no longer just the relationship of art to the witness of the art. Now you have a worker to customer relationship. Now you have a laborer to consumer relationship. And when that happens, the critic needs to also understand the business of that art. It's one thing to judge music on its aesthetic quality, but it is an incomplete critique if you're not going to talk about how that aesthetic quality plays into its value as a brand. Because when you are trying to generate a narrative, when you're trying to tell a story about whether or not an artist's project is meeting the needed effects, what are the needed effects? We're talking about two things that every artist wants to do: touch people and make money. And so critique is about figuring out how artists straddle that line and whether or not a body of work fulfills those two functions. Does a song or an album touch people while still becoming a valuable product in the currency of where it is competing at the moment? So critique is twofold in that sense, because artists are also cultural practitioners who take part in the culture industry, whose rules are governed by understanding the popular culture, the folk culture, and the all-round dimension of how these things filter back into and outside of the art itself. In other words, capitalism affects the way the artist produces their art, but it also affects the way the audience listens. Because taste is curated by our environment. And mass market has the buying power to show you things you didn't necessarily choose to see. Even in this day of the mobile phone, most ads are not necessarily those that are curated for your own taste. They are whatever the social site that you're on is working in business conjunction with, for the most part. The algorithms are a combination of what you're responding to, but also a bombardment of how big companies are injecting themselves into the internet and trying to capture the most important asset ever, our attention. So the second principle of distinguishing between opinion and critique is an understanding of the business of art. A song is not just a piece of art anymore, it is a product. So you judge it according to what it does as an artwork, but also what it functionally does as a product. Is it as valuable as it claimed to be? Is it worth its money? Does it stand up to its market value? And these different contexts have different rules. So the last principle of how to tell the difference between opinion and critique is an understanding of the changing climates. Because trend is always late. Everyday people are not governed by money making when their ideas come into effect. The money making comes as an afterthought of how these ideas can become more than just the visions of the subconscious. How can our ideas grow feelers, not only touch the world, but establish something so transcendent that it's able to stabilize our lives to a certain extent? And so, what distinguishes a regular hot or cold take from a critique is lastly paying attention to the ever-changing tides. Because the ever-changing tides of art are what allow for the different trends to fluctuate, for the different styles to move back and forth. A critic of a certain art form, say rap, understands the history of how hip-hop emerged, and from the culture, certain aspects were deconstructed. Rap became the most profitable, and through rap, a certain kind of rap emerged the most dominant out of all. A critic is able to trace the connection between so-called gangster rap to the crunk movement, to the hyphy movement, to the abstract rap movement, to eventually trap music, to all these different strands of how rap music has extended and developed over the years, and whether or not they still constitute the same thing, operate according to the same rules, and have the same values. If you want to practice critical theory, it's important you understand the relationship between differing artists in one scope or sound. It's important to understand what distinguishes all these quote-unquote genres. It's important to understand the emergence of these labels. It's important to understand all of the theory that ends up hanging itself as baggage on the actual art itself. Because then you're able to give a real breakdown of how we language our inspiration, how the music changes in effect, how these different trends are being influenced by certain environmental factors. So the critic is also a social scientist of a particular zone. The critic is there to try and understand, how did Amapiano emerge? And what can we learn about its particular sound? How can we learn the evolution of the log drum and how it eventually becomes so part and parcel of modern dance music? If a critic cannot tell you the origin and subsequent flow and ebb of these things, they're not doing critique at all. They're giving an opinion. If the only thing they're able to say is capture their own personal feelings into something, then what they are is a tastemaker. And there are spaces for tastemakers, for people who are popular enough to determine certain popular views because of their own magnitude and influence. But the critic divorces themselves from the process. And I think as a sub note, I would like to add that as Viwe Joka, I do not have the passion to become a big shot celebrity or influencer when we do these. I do this because I have a passion for the history of South African art, and I have a deep, deep yearning to see South Africans understand some of the hidden aspects of how the music that we consume becomes the way that it does, and to understand the ultimate political implications. And when I say political, I'm not talking about party politics. I'm talking about the power dynamics that govern the art we listen to, including governing the way that we are hearing the art. So I'm here to try and dissect those aspects of a work of art, and to, most importantly, not make it about me. This is not my show. This is not my podcast. I am a conduit to try and make sense of the different opinions that are in the air of our country and our continent and in the general world at the moment. It's an honor to be able to have you guys feed back into us and engage with us, challenge us, disagree with us, because it proves my chops as a critic. If I cannot explain to you clearly what I mean and where I'm coming from when I am breaking down and analyzing a work of art historically in the face of what its value is in the moment, then I have not done my job correctly. So you have one responsibility, if anything, while watching the Headspace. Hold me to my own voice as a critic. Make sure that this is never about my own opinion, but about something more. Trying to make sense and contextualize the different opinions into a historical analysis that looks at where the art is, as I said, in those two functions, aesthetically and socio-economically. So, in the final essence of what we are doing as the Headspace, this is what drives the measure and the standard of what we do. So, everybody can have an opinion, but only experienced and insightful people can have critiques. Your opinion is valid, but the moment you try to pass it off as a critique, you've got to prove that you know enough to analyze at that level, in that way. My name is VJ, the brother from the ancient mother, and this is what we do in the Headspace. Peace.